What are you? A man who just shattered restraints that no living species has ever broken.
There is a specific kind of quiet that settles over a military hangar when something happens that everyone present knows should be impossible. Not the silence of danger, which is tense and directed, every body angled toward the threat. Not the silence of confusion, which is scattered and muttering. This is something different, a flat, total stillness, the kind that falls when a human fact and a physical law collide in plain sight and one of them loses. That particular quiet fell across Saravni Shipyard 14 on a Tuesday morning station time, when a human supply pilot named Caleb Reyes stood in the center of a military hangar surrounded by armed soldiers, looked down at his own free hands, and said, with almost no inflection at all, "Huh." The Duralite restraints that had been on his wrists were now scattered across the floor in fragments. Shards of a material the Saravni military had been using for 18 years precisely, because no biological species in the known coalition had ever broken them, not under test conditions, not under desperation, not under anything. The tensile rating on Saravni military-grade Duralite was 4 times beyond the unassisted physical output of the strongest documented species in the coalition. The number was not an estimate. It had been tested, certified, and retested. It was, by any reasonable measure, one of the more settled facts in the field of materials engineering. Caleb Reyes had just unsettled it, not on purpose, which somehow made it worse. This is the story of how a bad week, a broken navigation system, and a pair of inexplicable hands started something neither a supply pilot nor a Saravni commander had any framework to predict, and how the most impossible thing either of them had ever witnessed turned out to be, in the end, not quite the strangest part of what followed. To understand what Caleb was doing in a Saravni shipyard hangar with his wrists cuffed behind his back, it is necessary to understand, briefly, what kind of person he was before any of this happened, and the honest answer is unremarkable by almost every measure his own species used for that word. He was 34 years old. He had been flying supply routes through the outer trade lanes for 11 years, since the month after his apprenticeship contract with a mid-range freight company expired, and he walked across the street to a smaller, scrappier operation that offered him his own ship and considerably fewer regulations, in that order of importance. His ship, a modified Havero-class hauler he had named the Myria, after no one he was willing to explain publicly, was old enough that her systems had opinions about how she wanted to be operated, and Caleb had long since stopped fighting those opinions on any matter that didn't affect the cargo. He flew alone. He preferred it that way, which was a fact he had come to terms with gradually, across a decade of routes that took him to places nobody who had choices tended to choose. The routes themselves were not glamorous. The outer trade lanes existed in the particular gray zone between the organized commercial corridors that the larger species maintained with dedicated traffic management and the genuine frontier where nothing was maintained at all. Supply haulers in this zone carried the things that did not move themselves, replacement parts for equipment that had been reliable for 20 years and then suddenly wasn't, medical supplies to stations whose primary physician had just taken a posting somewhere better funded, seeds, fertilizer, calibration tools, basic communications hardware. The unremarkable physical infrastructure of lives lived in places the galaxy's primary attention did not reach. It was unglamorous work, and it paid modestly, and it required, above almost everything else, the kind of self-sufficiency that grew not from confidence, but from the specific habit of never being close enough to help to call for it. Caleb had developed this habit the way most people developed habits that lasted not as a choice but as an adaptation, pressed into shape by years of circumstance until it fit too well to remove. He was not, by any definition the galaxy found impressive, extraordinary. He ate poorly when work was slow. He read technical manuals for recreation, which colleagues who knew about it found troubling. He kept his ship clean with a meticulousness that almost no other part of his life reflected. He had never in 11 years of supply hauling been late on a delivery without an excuse he was prepared to defend, which was, he would tell anyone who asked, not a moral position so much as a practical one. Late deliveries generated questions. Questions generated the kind of attention he had always found exhausting. The bad week had started, as bad weeks tend to, with something small. The Myria's navigation module had been running a persistent calibration error for the better part of a month. Nothing catastrophic, nothing that rounded her, just a 4-degree deviation in long-range jump plotting that Caleb kept compensating for manually, and kept meaning to get properly fixed. He had been on a course for the Vashani Outer Colonies, hauling a full cargo bay of agricultural equipment on a 3-day standard route he'd flown 17 times before, when the deviation interacted with an uncharted gravitational eddy near the Saravni border, and produced a corrected heading that his navigation system had apparently considered optimal, and his own attention 7 hours into a 12-hour leg, with 2 cups of poor-quality station coffee in his bloodstream. I had failed to catch in time. He was 40 minutes inside Saravni territorial space before the proximity alert went off. By then, the shipyard sensor net had already caught him, and the 2 Saravni intercept fighters that pulled alongside the Myria 12 minutes later were not. Their pilots made clear through the most basic of broadcast commands, requesting a conversation. Caleb had powered down voluntarily, transmitted his documentation without being asked, and cooperated entirely with the boarding team, because he was a man who understood which situations were worth arguing and which ones required a different approach. He had been marched off his own ship, across a hangar bay that smelled of hydraulic fluid and hot metal, and deposited in the center of a room that had been very specifically designed to make the people standing in the middle of it feel small. He had then waited, cuffed and mildly irritated, for 37 minutes while soldiers argued about jurisdiction in a language his translator processed at roughly 60% confidence, until the argument stopped entirely the moment Commander Veth walked through the far door. She was, by any honest accounting of the scene, exactly the kind of person who stopped arguments by walking into rooms. Not through volume, she had not raised her voice, had barely spoken, had simply appeared and allowed the accumulated weight of every decision she had ever made that turned out to be correct to speak on her behalf. The soldiers around her responded to this the way soldiers respond to authority they genuinely trust rather than merely acknowledge, which looks, to an outside observer, less like discipline and more like gravity. The Saravni were a humanoid species, roughly bipedal, within a range of height and proportion that made them readable to a human eye without being familiar enough to be comfortable. Their bone structure was denser than human average, their reflexes measurably faster, their culture organized around a hierarchical military tradition so old and so thoroughly embedded in their biology and their language and their architecture that distinguishing the culture from the species had always struck the handful of xenoanthropologists who'd studied them as a bit like asking where the river ended and the canyon began. They were not aggressive in the blunt sense. They were precise, which was, in practice, considerably more unsettling. Their military facilities had a quality that Caleb would later try to describe to a colleague who'd never been inside one, and would eventually give up and simply say, organized like a sentence in a language where every word is load-bearing. Nothing was wasted, nothing was decorative, nothing was present that didn't serve a function. And yet the function of everything, from the angled lighting that eliminated shadow without producing glare to the floor paneling that gripped differently under boot and under wheeled equipment, had been considered so carefully and executed so precisely that the whole thing carried a kind of aesthetic authority that purely practical spaces almost never had. It was a building that had been designed by people who considered both form and function, and had concluded that those were not, in fact, 2 different things. The hangar was 200 meters across. The Myria sat in a docking clamp near the far wall, looking, in this context, like the unremarkable machine she was, a functional, worn in the particular honest way that things get worn when they're used rather than displayed. Around her, 3 Saravni patrol vessels with their wing configurations folded into travel position, a larger transport with its cargo bay open and half unloaded, and the various precise movements of shipyard personnel who did not, in any of the 40 minutes Caleb stood waiting, appear to waste a single motion or repeat one unnecessarily. Commander Liariveth Lyra, in the abbreviated form her officers used when they were certain she wasn't listening, was tall even by Saravni standards, with pale gray-blue skin and platinum blonde hair braided into an elaborate pattern that Caleb's translator flagged with the note rank indicator, significance undetermined before giving up entirely. She wore battle armor with the settled ease of a person who had spent enough time in worse places that the armor had stopped feeling like equipment and started feeling like a second skin. Her eyes were a gray so pale they registered as almost colorless in the hangar's industrial lighting, and they settled on Caleb with the particular quality of attention that comes from someone who has spent a career making fast, accurate decisions about people, and is very rarely wrong. "You crossed into restricted territory," she said. Her translator module was better than the ones the soldiers had been using. Her words arrived with only the smallest lag, the syntax clean and the tone exactly calibrated. "Explain yourself." Caleb explained himself. Navigation malfunction, agricultural delivery, 17 times on this route without incident. He said it concisely, because she was clearly a person who found concision respectful, and he had always been good at reading rooms, even when the rooms contained people who were technically in the process of deciding what to charge him with. She studied him. "Your ship's logs will confirm or deny that claim." "They will," Caleb agreed. "I'd appreciate you checking sooner rather than later. The cuffs are uncomfortable, and I have a delivery deadline that's getting less realistic by the minute." Something crossed her face, a movement too small and too quickly suppressed for him to read its full meaning but present. A flicker in the formal composure, something that might, under other circumstances, have been called amusement. "You are very calm for a man in your position." "I've been in worse positions," Caleb said. "Statistically anyway, this is just inconvenient." The flicker disappeared. That is an unwise thing to say to a Saravni officer. "Probably," he agreed. "I've been told I have poor judgment about when to be quiet." She held his gaze for a moment longer, then turned to confer with one of her officers. A low, rapid exchange in Saravni that his translator caught fragments of without assembling into anything coherent. And it was during that conversation, in the specific gap between her attention and the moment it returned, that Caleb shifted his weight, felt the cuffs bite again into the same raw patches of wrist they'd been working on for the past 40 minutes, and without any deliberate intention at all, simply pulled against them. The way he might pull on a door he expected to be locked just to check. Just out of the vague, restless reflex of someone who had been uncomfortable for too long. The Duralite restraints did not hold. They came apart with a sound like breaking glass, a sharp, crackling fracture, fragments skittering across the hangar floor, a brief discharge of blue static electricity crackling at the broken edges before dissipating entirely into the air. Caleb stood looking at his own hands the way a person looks at something they do not fully recognize, despite its being attached to them. Then the hangar went quiet. Lyra turned back from her conversation and found the human prisoner standing with his hands free, broken military-grade restraints scattered at his feet, wearing an expression she had absolutely no category for: not defiance, not satisfaction, not even particular urgency. Something closer to mild, puzzled embarrassment, as though he'd accidentally knocked something off a shelf in someone else's house. She stood very still. Several of her officers raised their weapons on reflex. She stopped them with one hand without looking away from Caleb. "That is not possible," she said. "I agree," Caleb said. He had not moved, which she registered. He was standing exactly where he had been, his hands raised slightly at his sides in the universal gesture of harmlessness, a gesture that was almost comically inadequate given what his hands had just done and which he seemed to know was inadequate, which somehow made it stranger rather than less sincere. I'd like that on record. I didn't do anything unusual. I just pulled. Duralite restraints, she said more carefully now, have a tensile rating 4 times beyond the physical output of any known biological species. I know what Duralite is, Caleb said. He paused. I've worn cuffs before, not those particular cuffs. They're higher quality than what I've usually encountered. They still broke. How? It was not a question phrased like a question. Caleb looked at his hands again, turned them over once as if expecting some visible difference and found none. I don't know, he said. I genuinely do not know. The soldiers around the room were in the specific state of readiness that looks like preparation for action and is actually a kind of suspended indecision. Bodies angled, weapons raised, every instinct committed to the idea of response without any signal from their commanding officer to give the response a shape. Lyra was the signal. She had not yet decided what signal to give. This was, in Caleb's experience across various rooms full of armed personnel in various states of agitation, actually the more dangerous configuration, because indecision in armed groups could resolve itself in directions nobody in the room wanted. He kept his hands visible and did not move. I'm not trying to escape, he said, in what he hoped was a tone of absolute clarifying sincerity. I'm standing right here. I have no weapons. My ship is locked in your hangar. There is genuinely nowhere for me to go, and more importantly, I don't have any reason to want to go anywhere except back to the Vashani colonies with my agricultural equipment. I just wanted my wrists to stop hurting. The silence held for another 2 seconds. Then Lyra said something brief to her officers in Saravni, and the weapons came down, not holstered, not dismissed, but lowered, which was the correct intermediate step, and the decision itself, Caleb noticed, was followed without hesitation or visible doubt. Whatever authority she carried, it was the kind that worked. She crossed the distance between them, stopping close enough that he could see the individual structural details of her battle armor, the layered plating, the micro-scarring along the shoulder joint that told him the armor had absorbed real damage at some point and been repaired rather than replaced. Her hand rose toward his wrist, paused 3 centimeters short of contact, and stayed there. The specific hesitation of someone confronting evidence they cannot yet place. "What are you?" she asked very quietly. "A supply pilot with a navigation problem and apparently above-average grip strength," Caleb said. "I genuinely don't have a better answer than that. I'm sorry. I understand that's not helpful." She studied him for a long moment. "Have you broken restraints before?" "No, I've tried a few times in situations where it would have been useful and it didn't work. I've also never had Saravni military-grade restraints, which is admittedly a small sample size." "Pulled the same way. More or less." Lyra lowered her hand. Her expression had settled back into command neutrality, but there was something underneath it now, not the flat authority of before, but the specific attentiveness of a person trying to solve a problem they have not yet named. She said something to her officers that his translator processed as approximately "bring the medical unit," and then she looked back at Caleb. "You will stay," she said. It was not phrased as a question. "I already said I would." "You said it before when you had restraints on." Caleb looked at her. "The restraints weren't what was keeping me here." Something shifted in her pale eyes, something small and quick, and then gone. She turned away to speak to her officers. The medical scan took 40 minutes and produced results that the first Saravni science officer who reviewed them sent immediately and without comment to 2 colleagues. Because he had been in his field for 22 years and had a strong professional preference for not being the only one looking at something he didn't understand. His name was Dr. Vren, and he had the specific energy of a scientist who had spent a career being very good at explaining things, and who found the absence of an explanation considerably more interesting than most answers. He arrived in the medical bay with a data pad and an expression of barely contained curiosity that was the closest thing to enthusiasm Caleb had seen from anyone since entering the shipyard. Your bone density is within human standard range, Vren said, reviewing the scan results while walking, which he did with the practiced efficiency of someone who had trained himself to read and move simultaneously. Muscle fiber composition is unremarkable. No cybernetic augmentation, no detectable bioenhancement compounds, no implanted support structures. He looked up. You are, by every measurable biological metric, an ordinary human male of your age. I know, Caleb said. Then explain, Vren said, with the pleasant directness of someone who considered politeness a lower priority than accuracy, the cuffs. I can't. You must have felt something, a surge, a change in your own physical sense. Caleb thought about it. He had been thinking about it in the way he tended to process things that mattered, which was quietly and sideways and without forcing any conclusions until the shape of them became clear on its own. I felt the restraints and I pulled on them, he said. I've felt discomfort before. I've pulled against restraints before in situations where it mattered rather more than it did today. I've never had this happen. I don't feel different than I always have. I feel the way I always feel. And how is that? Functional, Caleb said, mostly. Vren's two colleagues arrived, reviewed the scan results, and became immediately and visibly absorbed in a scientific argument Caleb's translator processed at approximately 40% confidence, but which appeared to involve at least three competing theories, none of which seemed to satisfy SFY anyone offering them. The three scientists circled his scan data the way experts circle something that challenges them, not with skepticism, but with the specific focused intensity of people for whom a mystery is the most comfortable possible environment. Lyra stood at the edge of the medical bay's doorway, not participating in the scientific argument, watching Caleb instead. He was aware of her watching him, the way you become aware of a specific quality of attention in a room full of other attentions, something more precise, more evaluative, still carrying that undertone of a problem being named. You're not going to find anything in the scan, he said, not to the scientists, to her. Probably not, she agreed, but ruling out explanations is not without value. Untrue. Vren looked up from his argument long enough to say, with the absent certainty of someone reporting a fact from a great distance, the cuffs were rated for the maximum biological output of a Korathi elite-class combatant, which is the most physically capable species in the coalition. You exceeded that rating. Significantly. The fracture pattern suggests the force applied was not sustained but instantaneous, a single application of force that the material had no time to distribute. He went back to his arguments. Caleb absorbed this. Huh, he said again, with the same flat, mildly surprised inflection he'd used when he'd first looked at his free hands. Lyra crossed the bay and stopped in front of him. Up close, closer than she'd stood since the hangar floor, she was a few centimeters taller than him, which was not the detail he registered most clearly. What he registered most clearly was that she was looking at him the same way she'd looked at the broken restraints, as an established fact that needed to be understood, not decided about. There was something almost more comfortable in that than suspicion would have been. Tell me about the situations, she said, the other times you pulled against restraints. He told her, 2 incidents, one genuine arrest in a border system where a customs inspector had been operating considerably outside his authority and looking for anything worth confiscating from a cargo hauler unlikely to have legal resources, and one situation 3 years ago in a malfunctioning docking collar that had locked shut with his hand inside the access panel, in which the choice had been between pulling and losing the hand. In the first case, he'd pulled and the restraints had held, and he'd waited 4 hours until the inspector got bored and moved on. In the second case, he'd pulled and the collar mechanism had shifted slightly and his hand had come free, which he'd attributed at the time entirely to the mechanism's own malfunction rather than anything he'd done. Lyra listened without interrupting. You have no explanation for why today was different. The only variable I can identify is the quality of the restraints, Caleb said, which doesn't actually explain anything because better restraints should be harder to break, not easier. "Oh, yes," she said, "that is the problem." It took a further 2 hours for the full log verification to complete. The Myria's navigation data cross-referenced against the Sarovni sensor net's own records of the entry, a process that Lyra oversaw directly and that confirmed precisely as Caleb had told it. The malfunction and the deviation and the 42 minutes he'd spent inside restricted space before anything started flashing red. The release authorization came through at the end of the 6th hour. Lyra reviewed it, signed it, and came to find him where he'd been sitting in the corridor outside the medical bay after Vren had eventually concluded there was nothing left to measure and asked him politely but pointedly to stop being in the room where the data was. "Your documentation is verified," she said. "Your delivery delay has been officially registered as the result of a navigational incident in restricted territory with no violation finding. A formal letter for your client is being prepared." "Thank you," Caleb said. "Genuinely, that's more than I expected." She studied him. "You expected to be held longer." "I expected to be held a lot longer," he said. 6 hours full clearance letter for my client by the standards of unintentional territorial incursions. That's an efficient outcome." "You are familiar with the standards." "I've read about them theoretically. I've not previously needed them personally." "I am required to file a full report on this incident," Lyra said. "It will result in further contact, coalition scientific interest at minimum." She paused, and the command neutrality did something he was beginning to recognize as its version of hesitation, a slight change in the texture of the formality, a degree of care in the next sentence that wasn't there in the previous ones. "I intend to be present for that conversation when it occurs." "I'd like that," Caleb said. He meant it, which was true, and he was aware he meant it rather more than the plain words conveyed, which was also true, and which he chose not to address directly because he was in a Sarovni military facility 6 hours into what had already been an unusual enough day. She walked him to the hangar herself, which her officers clearly registered as unusual. He caught the quiet exchanges, the slight recalibrations of the room's social order, and stopped at the foot of the Myria's boarding ramp. The ship looked exactly as he'd left it, which was reassuring. The boarding team had been thorough. He could see the evidence of the inspection in the careful, consistent way things had been opened and closed, but nothing was missing or damaged, which was more than he could have guaranteed from some of the customs teams he'd dealt with in less organized sectors. "Try not to break anything else before the scientists arrive," Lyra said. Caleb looked at her. She was managing a very specific expression, one that carried the weight of everything that had happened in the past 6 hours behind a composure that was not indifference, but professional discipline applied with considerable effort. "No promises," he said. For the first time since the cuffs had shattered, since all of that particular impossible quiet had fallen across the hangar floor, she smiled. Not the suppressed flicker from earlier. A real one, brief and genuine, there for a moment and then gone, but present enough that he registered it clearly and would think about it later. He boarded his ship. She turned and walked back toward the inner doors. He watched through the Myria's forward port as the hangar doors sealed below him, and then he ran his pre-flight sequence and filed his exit vector and lifted out of Sarovni Shipyard 14 in the particular mood that comes after something has happened that you don't have a category for yet, not good or bad, not resolved or unresolved, but changed in some way that is going to take time to understand. The Myria held a heading for Vashani space, and Caleb sat in the pilot's seat with a cup of coffee he hadn't properly tasted and thought about the broken restraints, and then about what Vren had said about the fracture pattern instantaneous, a single application of force, and then about the previous 2 incidents, which he was now reconstructing with considerably more attention than he'd paid them at the time. The first incident in the border system with the corrupt customs inspector. He had pulled, he was sure of that. The restraints had held and he'd attributed the failure to the restraints' quality and that had been the end of it. But he also remembered more clearly now that he was looking for it, the specific quality of frustration he'd had that day, not panic. He didn't panic, but a low, cold, sustained anger about the situation, the inspector, the wasted time, the principle of the thing. And in that state, the pulling had felt not different exactly, but more deliberate, more intentional, as if the decision to pull had been made somewhere below the level at which he made most decisions. The second incident, the docking collar, he had been frightened, not the surface variety of frightened. Genuinely below the surface frightened, the specific fear of someone watching a mechanical system prepare to do something permanent to his body. And in that state, the pull had produced the shift in the collar, which he had immediately labeled as the collar's own malfunction because the alternative, that he had done something, had been a thought he hadn't been equipped, at the time, to finish. Today, in the Saravni hangar, discomfort. Not rage, not fear. Just the specific sustained irritation of a person who has been in an uncomfortable physical position for too long and whose patience with it has quietly run out. And in that state, the pull had shattered military-grade duralite with a sound like breaking glass. The pattern, if it was a pattern, and he was careful, sitting in the pilot's seat watching stars smear through the jump window not to decide that it was before he had more information, was not consistent in the magnitude of the result. It was consistent in the character of the input. A sustained emotional state, not a sharp one. Not a spike of adrenaline, which was how most people imagined extraordinary physical output worked. Something quieter than that. Something that built. He did not know what to do with this information, and he was experienced enough in not knowing to recognize that the correct response to genuinely not knowing was to wait, and to pay attention, and to not fill in the blank with something comfortable just because the blank was uncomfortable. He thought about Lyra, about the look she'd given the broken restraints, which was the look of someone confronting a fact they were going to solve rather than dismiss, and about the careful way she'd said, "I intend to be PR." Essent for that conversation, which had not been the language of institutional curiosity, but something more specific than that, more deliberate. The sentence of a person who had already decided something and was choosing their words to reflect the decision exactly. He thought about the fact that she'd smiled. He thought about it more than he intended to, which was itself a piece of information he filed quietly alongside everything else. The agricultural equipment arrived in the Vashani outer colonies 3 days late. He filed the delay documentation with the formal Saravni letter attached. His client, a methodical man who had been farming the same soil on the same colony rock for 23 years and had very fixed ideas about schedules, read the letter, read it again, looked up at Caleb standing in the cargo bay doorway and said, "Saravni military, you broke their cuffs." "That's the short version," Caleb said. The farmer looked at him for another moment, then simply began directing the equipment offload. Because some facts Caleb had noticed were easier to absorb when you had something to do with your hands. The contact came 18 days later, not the council's scientific directorate, as Lyra had predicted, or not them first. First was a message from Saravni Fleet Command, direct to the Myria Secure Channel, formally requesting Caleb's presence at a research consultation session to be held at a neutral coalition station in the Outer Ven system. The message was signed by Commander Lieraveth. There was a single line below the official language, in a slightly different formatting that suggested it had been added after the formal text was already written. "I told you they would contact you. This is me keeping my word." Caleb read the message twice, set it down, picked it up, read it a third time, and then wrote a response that he revised 4 times before sending, unusually high revision count by his own habits, which confirmed he would attend and asked whether there were any materials he should prepare. Her response arrived within 6 hours. "Nothing, the scientists have questions, so do I bring yourself." He arrived at the Outer Ven station on a clear schedule, having rerouted 2 smaller deliveries to make the timing work. which was something he would not normally have done for a consultation he had not agreed to and had not been compensated for attending. He did not examine this too closely. Vren was their older colleague than expected, apparently appointed lead on the scientific side, who greeted Caleb with the specific enthusiasm of someone who has had 18 days to think about a problem and has generated more questions than answers. Two other researchers flanked him, one Saravni, one from a coalition species Caleb didn't recognize, tall, four-armed, with a biometric scanner that it held in two of its four hands with the ease of long habit. Lyra was there. Across the room from the scientists, positioned with the habitual spatial awareness of someone whose instinct was always to know where all the exits were. Wearing a version of Saravni military dress that was quieter than the battle armor, formal, precise, unmistakably rank, with her platinum blonde braid in a configuration slightly different from the one in the hangar, which his translator still flagged as rank indicator, significance undetermined, which was beginning to feel like a gap in the translation software. He was going to have to find another way to bridge. She nodded when she saw him. It was a small, specific nod, not a greeting exactly, more like an acknowledgement of something already decided. He nodded back. Vren's questions were thorough, well-organized, and covered every aspect of the incident that Caleb had already spent 18 days thinking about on his own, plus several angles that he hadn't considered. The four-armed researcher ran a second set of scans, more detailed than the shipyard's medical equipment had been capable of, and produced results that were, by all visible evidence, equally inconclusive. There was, by every available metric, nothing different about Caleb Reyes's biology. Nothing that would explain what had happened. The theory we keep returning to, Vren said at the end of 3 hours with the cheerful directness of a scientist who finds a good unsolved question more energizing than most answers, is that you are doing something we do not yet have the vocabulary to describe. Not a physical anomaly. A physical process. Something that is present in you and is activated under specific conditions, but which does not leave a visible biological trace because the biology itself is not the mechanism. The mechanism is something else. What mechanism? Caleb asked. That, Vren said happily, is the question. Caleb looked across the room at Lyra, who had been listening to the entire 3 hours without offering a single comment to the scientists, which he suspected was not because she didn't any, but because her comments were going to be for a different conversation. After Vren's team concluded and dispersed, still arguing their competing theories down the corridor, the room settled into the specific quiet of two people who have been aware of each other for 3 hours without addressing it directly. You told me to bring myself, Caleb said. The scientists seem to want something more specific. The scientists want a mechanism, Lyra said. She moved from the window to the table, sitting across from him in the careful, deliberate way she did everything, nothing approximate, nothing accidental. I want something different. What? I want to understand what you think is happening, she said. Not what you can prove, what you think. 18 days is a long time to think about something like this, and you are not a person who doesn't think. He told her about the pattern he'd found. The emotional state, the deliberateness below the level of deliberate decision, the 3 incidents and their differences and their consistency. He told it plainly, without conclusions he wasn't willing to support, and she listened with the particular quality of attention she'd given him in the hangar, not deciding anything while he spoke, only receiving. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You've been afraid before." "Oh yes. Properly afraid, the kind that changes what the body does." "Oh yes. And it didn't produce this." "It's not that I know of, not at that magnitude." She turned this over. Then the fear is not the variable. The other kind, the sustained, cold kind, that is the variable. Irritation in the hangar, something older and steadier in the collar incident. Anger in the arrest. All quiet, she said, not explosive, sustained. "Oh yes." Interesting, she said, which was not the word he'd expected. and which landed differently than any of the scientific vocabulary the past 3 hours had produced. They sat across the table in the neutral station's consultation room, and the conversation turned by degrees, not through any engineered transition, just through the natural movement of two people who had started with the broken cuffs and were finding, without any particular plan, that the broken cuffs were not actually the most interesting thing either of them had to say. The session was scheduled for 3 hours. They were still in the room at the end of the fifth. There would be more consultations. Vren's team would produce a preliminary paper, then retract it, then produce a different one. The coalition's broader scientific apparatus would develop an institutional interest that generated meeting requests at a rate Caleb eventually had to route through a dedicated contact address, because otherwise they interfered with delivery scheduling. The paper, when it finally existed in a form its authors were willing to publish, would use careful language to describe a phenomenon it could measure in its effects but not in its cause, and would conclude in its final paragraph that human physiology potentially contained mechanisms not yet understood, which was either the most cautious possible way to say something extraordinary or the most honest way to say we don't know yet, and was probably both simultaneously. The agricultural equipment contract was renewed on time the following season. Caleb had the Myria's navigation system fully recalibrated at a repair station he had long meant to visit, which meant the specific 4-degree deviation was corrected, which meant the exact sequence of events that had produced the entry into Sarovni space could not be precisely replicated by accident. He had not, when the technician asked whether this was a priority repair, hesitated for any longer than he would later feel comfortable fully accounting for. Commander Leariveth's next message arrived 11 days after the Outer Ven session. It was not a consultation request. It was a message, 2 paragraphs, the first about a Sarovni patrol report from the sector near the Vashani colonies, and the second about a species she'd encountered during a diplomatic posting that she'd thought he would find interesting and had meant to mention in the meeting and then hadn't. It was unmistakably the message of a person who had found a reason to write and had located a plausible subject to write about. He wrote back about the Vashani farming colony and the client who'd read the Sarovni letter and simply redirected his attention to the equipment offload, about the navigation module and the repair and the pause before he'd confirmed it as a priority. He wasn't sure whether that last detail was overly candid. He sent it anyway. She replied within 4 hours. The message was 3 paragraphs, and the third paragraph said, in the particular precise language she used when she had decided something and was choosing her words exactly, I mentioned the initial incident in my official report, but not the way you described noticing her watching you. I am mentioning it now in this context because I think it is relevant. Caleb read this 3 times, then sat with it for a while, looking at the jump window and the stars beyond it, traveling at good speed toward the next delivery on a schedule he had built with. He would later admit slightly less efficiency than usual, not less precision, just more space, more margin, more of the kind of time that let one thing lead naturally to the next. The broken cuffs remained on Sarovni Shipyard 14's hangar floor in the official incident log, evidence in a file that still had more questions than answers. They were the first impossible thing, and they had produced, in the way that impossible things sometimes do when they happen to 2 people at the same time in the same room, something that neither of them had planned. Everything else arrived exactly when it was supposed to.